challenge of modernity. This is what we're going to talk about in this video. And there are roughly 4 parts to it: the experience of modernity, the fear of freedom, the socializing effect of the international system, and the failure to compete in that system by most Arab societies. And look, let's start with a book of literary criticism, not law. Marshall Berman's book, All That Solid Melts into Air. And in this book, Berman describes modernity as the attempt by modern men and women to make themselves at home in this process, to become subjects as well as objects of modernization. And he describes the experience as a life of paradox and contradiction. Because modernity brings at the same time enormously powerful tools for industrial production, scientific insights, bureaucratic innovations, cultural change. But with these opportunities come with this power to control comes the fear of destruction of old communities, values, and even individuals. And so this control that is now possible by particularly the state breeds anxiety and resentment. But modern life transforms the living environment of people very dramatically, from the old static lives to what you see, as you see in this photo. It's a street scene from Cairo. You already see the dynamism of modernity, and the pressure and charm of modernity lies in this dynamism. This is what makes it attractive. People want to live it. And this dynamism is premised on a process of constant and never-ending cycle of creative destruction. As you see here, this is an Egyptian horse-drawn carriage, public transport as it began in Egypt. But as you can see now, quickly they move on. Modernity brings new things in. This is a new tramway, the station in Alexandria that was built in the 1930s. And this is Tahrir Square in Cairo in the 1950s, roughly. So you see the lives of the people there is, within a very short span, is transformed, and it's transformed to the better. This dynamism is tangible. You can almost feel it. And the key driver of this process is money and profits. And we will see later in this video, there's a strong resentment against the materialistic aspect of modernity. But before we turn to this, this photo, for example, shows the production processes that are now being exported into the third world, including the Muslim world. So before we come to this material aspect of production and the search for profits, let's go back briefly to Berman's book. It deals heavily with the figure of Faust, Goethe's Faust, which is the embodiment of someone who is now part of this modernization process, but is held down by his traditional stagnant society. And in a sense, Faust represents the classical intellectual from an underdeveloped country that looks to more advanced societies with this volatile mixture of shame and pride. Pride in his old culture, but shame of being underdeveloped. And just as Germany developed after France and that again after England, you see in the third world, and particularly in the Muslim countries, modernity is now coming very, very fast. It's coming from the outside. Here in this photo, you see the headquarters of the Suez Canal Company. It's a foreign financed and foreign run operation in Egypt. And this external aspect of modernity and its product makes the process not just faster, but also a lot harder to accept and to come to grips with the local population, because it's now physically symbolized in ethnically different white colonialists, as you see in this photo from French colonialists in Tunisia. The people are ethnically different and identifiably other. And the process is faster. So the costs that this process of modernization always imposes are outweighed with the wealth of opportunities, but the threats are considerable, and they're stronger the faster the process happens. And it is going faster in the underdeveloped world, particularly in the Muslim world. And this is a process that it's not unique to the Muslim world. It has been experienced, for example, by Russia in the 19th century, and Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel, the Brothers Karamazov, and in that novel there's a parable of the Grand Inquisitor. It deals exactly with this process of individuals who cannot come to grips with the turmoil of modernity. And in the Grand Inquisitor, it's a parable of the second coming of Christ. He comes at the height of the Inquisition. He does wonders, people recognize him, start adore him, and then the church comes in and arrests him and orders him to be burnt at the stake the next day. And in the night in the prison, the Grand Inquisitor comes and talks to Christ, and he tells him that he and the church have realized that this is indeed Christ, so it's not a question of mistaken identity, but he tells Christ that his coming would now endanger the mission of the church. And he describes the mission of the church in the following terms. And it's exactly this problem of freedom that we will discuss. And I'm quoting, he says, "Man prefers peace and even death to freedom of choice in the knowledge of good and evil. Nothing is more seductive for man than his freedom of conscience, but nothing is a greater cause of suffering." So it says, man is weighted down by this fearful burden of free choice. And in exchange, and he's willing to give up this freedom in exchange for spiritual, even more than material certainty. And that's something that we discussed already. And I encourage you to read this text, which is freely available online, and the link is provided in the materials. So the fear of uncertainty, both in material terms, but also in spiritual terms, creates a very powerful force for everybody who's undergoing the modernization process. So it's a universal sentiment that is not at all unique to the developing world, and certainly not unique to the Muslim world. And it's something that the German Jewish psychologist Erich Fromm has described in his book, The Fear of Freedom. And here he describes it, he says freedom, it's two parts. There's freedom from, a negative freedom from restrictions of traditional authority, want, etc. And this is what the language of rights normally addresses, where you resist the imposition of strictures on you. But he says modernity takes away these it creates a negative freedom, it takes these restrictions away, but it simultaneously creates what Durkheim called anomie, a sense of emptiness, the loss of the certainty of past. And therefore, according to Fromm, this freedom, the negative freedom from restrictions, must be counterbalanced by a positive freedom to realize oneself in creative act and to build meaningful relationships with others. And this search for authenticity is particularly strong in societies that undergo very rapid change. And here, as he describes, and I think he's correct, he said that this normative uncertainty creates a propensity to fall for authoritarian solutions that substitute for the uncertainty something that replaces the old community with a new authoritarian body, which tells people what to think and what to act, and therefore gives them back the certainty that they need. And I think this psychological aspect is a strong element in what we have described earlier on, the Arab social contract, the authoritarian bargain. So it's not just the populations that keep quiet in return for material goods, it's also that they crave a psychological home, which again is not something that is unique to Muslim societies. So if modernity is such a mixed bag, its offerings come with such heavy costs, why not simply opt out? Preserve your stable socioeconomic arrangement and just leave the external world to its own devices. After all, if you remember, this is exactly the arrangement that Japan took for many centuries. The ruling samurais closed off their country precisely to protect the peculiar social and political arrangement that the country had. Because they knew once they would engage with foreigners, there would be an irresistible pressure for change. And this element of competitiveness is what Kenneth Waltz in his book, The Theory of International Politics, describes as the socialization effect of the international system. And he says any unit placed in a competitive environment, be it states in an anarchical system, or firms in open markets, or students at meritocratic universities, they will be forced to adapt any innovation that another actor in that system has brought, because otherwise they will face the consequences of that other actor now deriving the benefits from that innovation and they not being able to use these benefits to defend themselves. So over time, actors in competitive environments will become alike. They are socialized into looking the same. And the key driver here are material factors, so innovations in production, innovations in organizing your government, organizing your armies. And the rejection of such materialist thinking lies at the heart of much of romantic opposition to modernity in the arts, and we have described it before. It's one strong element in Faust. But it's also a powerful component in the anti-modernist political movements that we see throughout the world, but particularly in the 20th century in the Islamic context. So if you look, for example, here at this extract from the very long and peculiar preamble of the 1979 Iranian Revolutionary Constitution, which is very long, which makes an explicit rejection of this materialist thinking in the economy. And I'm quoting, "This principle contrasts with other economic systems where the aim is concentration and accumulation of wealth and maximization of profit. In materialist schools of thought, the economy represents an end in itself, so that it comes to be a subversive and corrupting factor in the course of man's development. In Islam, the economy is a means, and all that is required of a means is that it should be an efficient factor contributing to the attainment of the ultimate goal." Don't forget, this is the actual constitutional preamble, which is the longest of any constitutional preambles that we have. So here we have an explicit rejection as saying, by charismatic fiat, the constitutional draft that decides we will not be part of the competitive economy that is governing everybody else's lives. We are opting out. And the question is whether that's possible. You all know the answer. It has not been possible for the Islamic Republic to really create an alternative economic system. So, which brings us to the last point of today's lecture, which is the failure to compete effectively in this international system. And perhaps nothing more is powerful as a symbol of the competitiveness of the international system is the military performance of Muslim societies that has been generally quite weak. And the most dramatic instance of this failure to compete effectively had been the 1967 war against Israel, which led to the virtual annihilation of many Muslim armies and the total delegitimization of the governments that had been in power until that point. The failure of most, if not all, Muslim nations to compete effectively in the 20th century in the international system is manifested across virtually all important socioeconomic indicators, be it literacy, being infant mortality, longevity, economic productions, patents, scientific productions, etc. And we will, in the next video, we will look at some of these indicators as they reflect on the abilities of governments to compete.